What are the responsibilities of the data processor in GDPR? In this video, I want to talk about the role of the processor in relation to the controller. Hi, I'm Jared Norris from GDPR-KNOW. I put this video together because I've been asked on a few occasions to try and clarify what the processor needs to do when operating on behalf of a data controller. This is only one of the areas of responsibility for the processor. Before we go any further, let's get a better understanding of some of the topics. We'll start with personal data. So personal data is any information that can be identifiable to an individual. Now we look at the data controller. The data controller is also known as the controller. So the data controller is responsible for the keeping and use of personal information on computers or in filing systems. And this role carries serious legal responsibilities. Data controllers can be either legal entities such as companies, government departments, or voluntary organisations. Or they can be individuals such as GPs, pharmacists, or sole traders. You are a controller if you keep or process personal data about living people. A controller determines the purpose and means of processing personal data. In other words, the controller determines why the personal data is being gathered and how it will be processed. Now for the data processor, also known as the processor. If you hold or process personal data, but don't exercise responsibility or control over it, then you're a data processor. Data processors could be payroll companies, accountants, they could be training companies for government bodies, etc. They process personal data on behalf of a data controller. So it is possible to be a controller and a processor. An accountant will be a controller for the processing of their own company's personal data, but will be a processor on behalf of their clients. Okay, now that we have those areas covered, let's take a look at some of the responsibilities of the data processor under Article 28 and Recital 81 of the GDPR. As before, these are only some of the responsibilities of the data processor. Article 28 and Recital 81 are very clear about how data should be processed by a processor working for a controller. The responsibilities of the processor and controller are very similar when it comes to processing. The controller and processor should agree on the processing of the personal data, as they can be both liable for non-compliance, and that includes the financial penalties as well. Controllers are also liable for their choice of processor. The processor must be able to provide sufficient guarantees that they will meet the requirements of the GDPR and that they will protect the rights of the data subjects. They must have their own organisational and technical structures in place. A written contract is required between the controller and the processor. This is to ensure that both parties understand their responsibilities and liabilities. The contract must be in writing and in electronic format. So processors must only act on the documented instructions of a controller. That said, they will have some direct responsibilities under GDPR and may be subject to fines or other sanctions if they don't comply. The GDPR sets out what should be included in the contract, but there are no standard clauses at this time. That said, the contract should include the following. The controller will ensure that the processor has the required structures in place. And the processor will only process personal data based on the instructions from the controller. And they will follow the guidelines when selecting a sub-processor as well. At the end of a service, they will delete or return all the personal data to the controller. And at all times, they will be able to demonstrate compliance with GDPR. They will also immediately inform the controller if, in their opinion, an instruction infringes the regulation. So what does that mean? If a controller requests a task from the processor, which is a potential non-compliance, the processor should let the controller know immediately. The processor will not select a sub-processor without prior specific or general written authorization from the controller. Processors are also liable for the use of subprocessors. Where a subprocessor fails in its duties, the processor will remain fully liable to the controller. So the same obligations apply between the controller and processor as it does between the processor and subprocessor. In other words, the controller must be diligent when selecting a processor, and in turn a processor must be as diligent when selecting a subprocessor. If a processor determines the purposes and means of processing the personal data, the processor will be classified as a controller in respect of that processing. This would be a major non-conformance for the data processor, so don't do that. So be very clear about this. That's the role of the controller. The purpose and the means, the why and the how. That's the controller's job, not the processor. For larger companies and organisations who've been operating under similar guidelines for a number of years, there's nothing majorly new in GDPR. For smaller organisations who are new to the concept of outsourcing data processing, or who may have been engaging in this practice in the absence of formal structures or documentation, there is action required now. Okay, let's look at some of the key takeaways. Number 1, controllers are liable for their compliance with their selection of processors. If the controller makes a poor choice of processor, they can be held liable. It's worth remembering that non-compliance can include a number of separate items. Number 2, the processor now has increased responsibilities similar to the controller. Although the processor is working under the controller's direction, they are still accountable for other areas. For example, they must have their own organisational and technical structures in place. Number 3, a processor who processes data without permission becomes a controller. Sometimes it may appear to be a risk for a processor to push a controller to have a written agreement. In the absence of an agreement and permission, you are a controller, which brings with it all of the responsibilities. You also have a major non-compliance issue. Number 4, the controller needs to have an agreement and a written contract with the processor. By having an agreement in place prior to documenting the contract, the processor gets the opportunity to influence some of the wording in the contract. Number 5, a processor must have approval from the controller before engaging a subprocessor. So once again, a processor may take it upon themselves to subcontract out part of the processing. Don't go there, stay compliant, get the approval from the controller. If you are rejected, don't engage a subprocessor. Renegotiate your position with the controller. Number 6, a failure on the part of the subprocessor results in a non-compliance for the processor. The controller is responsible for selecting the processor who will meet all of the GDPR requirements. The processor has the same responsibility when selecting a subprocessor. Think about a courier company who outsources deliveries to independent drivers. If the drivers mess up, the client is not interested to know that these guys are not part of the courier's organisation. They gave the job to the courier, not the driver. So, get it right. Get it right first time, get it right every time. Okay, I'm aware that there's a lot to take in here. That said, GDPR is here to stay. Don't be a statistic. If you've not taken action yet, go and do it now. If you require assistance for your business in this area, give Jared a call on 086 809 6130 or international +353 86 809 6130. Before I go, there's a link below where you can find a copy of Article 28 and Recital 81 on the GDPR-KNOW website blog. Just scroll to the end of the page on the link. So Article 28 and Recital 81 should not be viewed in isolation. They are only part of the responsibilities of the data processor. I just want to finish up with a quick disclaimer. The information provided here is not intended as legal advice. If you require legal advice, please contact a legal specialist directly. Many thanks for watching.